On the night of the 23rd of October 1942, the desert north of Alamein erupted under the fire of hundreds of British guns. Axis commanders had expected the main blow farther south and later. They were wrong about both. For weeks, their reconnaissance aircraft had photographed an army assembling in the open desert. Supply dumps, artillery positions, vehicle tracks, water tanks, and more than 400 armored vehicles. The evidence looked overwhelming. It was also manufactured. Many of those tanks were canvas and palm frond frames. The guns were dummies. The supply depots were stage sets. Meanwhile, the real British armor had moved north under lightweight covers that made tanks look like ordinary trucks from the air. This was Operation Bertram, a deception built not around one clever prop, but around an entire false military system. The British did not simply hide the army that would attack Rommel's line. They constructed another army for Axis intelligence to discover. And when the guns opened fire, the wrong army was still the one the enemy believed. To understand why that illusion mattered, rewind 4 months. On the 21st of June 1942, Tobruk fell. The port had survived a long siege the year before and had become a symbol of British resistance in North Africa. This time, it collapsed in a single day. Roughly 33,000 Allied troops went into captivity, along with fuel, food, vehicles, and stores Rommel desperately needed. The British 8th Army retreated east across Libya and into Egypt, abandoning positions that had cost thousands of lives to win. The road ahead led toward Alexandria, Cairo, the Suez Canal, and the oil routes beyond the Middle East. If Rommel broke through Egypt, Britain would not merely lose another desert battlefield, it could lose the strategic hinge connecting the Mediterranean, India, and the wider empire. The retreat finally stopped near an obscure railway halt called El Alamein. There, the map narrowed. The Mediterranean blocked movement to the north. The Qattara Depression salt marshes, soft ground, and steep escarpments blocked a wide armored sweep to the south. Between them lay a corridor roughly 40 miles across. There would be no grand flanking march around this battlefield. Rommel knew where the British had to stand. The British knew where Rommel had to defend. Both armies could see the roads, the dust, and the supply traffic gathering behind the lines. That made Bernard Montgomery's problem brutally simple. He needed to assemble enough men, tanks, artillery, fuel, and ammunition to smash through a fortified Axis front. But every vehicle crossing the desert left tracks. Every convoy raised dust. Every new depot changed the landscape. German and Italian reconnaissance aircraft could photograph those changes, compare them day after day, and watch the offensive being built. One delay could expose the concentration before it was ready. One clear aerial photograph could give Axis reserves time to move toward the real attack. Montgomery could not make an army of that size disappear. So British planners chose something more dangerous. They would let the enemy see everything. Then they would make sure it meant the wrong thing. By August 1942, El Alamein was no longer just a railway stop on the Egyptian coast. It was the last door before the Nile Delta. Look at the battlefield from above. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south stretched the Qattara Depression, a vast basin of salt marsh, soft sand, and broken escarpments that mechanized formations could not cross in strength. Between them, the desert narrowed into a corridor. Rommel could no longer sweep around the British flank as he had done farther west. Montgomery could not simply bypass the Axis defenses either. Both armies were locked inside the same strip of ground. Across that corridor, German and Italian troops had built layers of trenches, anti-tank positions, wire, and deep minefields. Rommel called those mine belts the Devil's Gardens. They were not thin lines on a map. They were broad zones packed with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, covered by artillery and guns waiting for anything forced into the cleared lanes. If British engineers failed to open those lanes, the infantry would be stranded in front of the defenses and the tanks would pile up behind them. Montgomery understood the problem immediately after taking command of the 8th Army in August. He had inherited a force that had been retreating for weeks, but he now possessed something Rommel did not: time to rebuild, and a growing flood of men and machines. By October, the 8th Army had more than 190,000 troops, over 1,000 tanks, roughly 900 artillery pieces, and 1,400 anti-tank guns. It was a multinational force drawn from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Greece, France, and other parts of the Empire and Allied world. That strength created its own weakness. An offensive army drinks fuel before it fires a shot. Tanks need ammunition, spare tracks, oil, water, recovery vehicles, workshops, and roads strong enough to carry their weight. Artillery needs thousands of shells moved forward in lorries. Infantry divisions need food, medical stations, signal cables, and marked routes through the night. The larger Montgomery's force became, the harder it was to conceal its purpose. Rommel's intelligence officers did not need to read Montgomery's mind. They only needed to count vehicles, compare aerial photographs, trace new tracks, and watch where fuel and water began accumulating. In open desert, logistics could reveal an attack days before the first gun fired. From the Axis side, that logic was not foolish. It was professional. The British offensive had to concentrate somewhere. The minefields meant engineers had to prepare routes. Armor could not operate without fuel. Tens of thousands of men could not assemble without water. Find the logistical buildup, and you found the coming battle. Montgomery also faced pressure from London. Winston Churchill wanted action. The British public had endured Gazala, Tobruk, and a long sequence of defeats. But Montgomery refused to attack before his army was trained and supplied. He intended to strike only when the odds had been deliberately stacked. That meant the build-up would continue for weeks. Every additional day made the 8th Army stronger. Every additional day also gave Axis reconnaissance another chance to discover the real concentration in the north. The normal answer would have been camouflage, nets over tanks, dispersed depots, movement after dark. But camouflage could not erase more than 1,000 tanks from an empty horizon. The battlefield itself had created the trap. The Axis knew the British had to attack through the corridor. They only needed to determine which section and when. So Montgomery's staff stopped asking how to hide the preparations. They began asking a different question. What would the enemy need to see in order to become certain of the wrong answer? The solution did not come from a cavalry officer or a tank commander. It came from a filmmaker. In 1941, Geoffrey Barkas had been appointed Director of Camouflage at British headquarters in Cairo. Before the war, he had worked in cinema. Now his unit included Royal Engineers, painters, architects, zoologists, sculptors, and men who understood how sets looked through a camera. That background mattered because Operation Bertram was not really a construction problem. It was a problem of viewpoint. A German reconnaissance pilot would not land beside a vehicle, touch its armor, or measure its gun barrel. He would pass thousands of feet overhead, moving fast, looking through dust, glare, shadow, and a camera lens. From that height, a tank was not steel. It was a silhouette, a shadow, a pattern of tracks, and a place on a photograph. Barkas understood that the decoy did not need to fool a mechanic standing 10 yards away. It only needed to survive the enemy's method of seeing. By mid-September 1942, Barkas and his deputy, the artist Tony Ayrton, were drawn into the cover plan for Montgomery's offensive. Their task was larger than anything the camouflage organization had attempted before. They had to conceal the real concentration in the north, create a convincing concentration in the south, and maintain both illusions while thousands of vehicles continued moving. Inside workshops near Cairo and Helwan, the desert war began to look like a film studio. Wooden ribs were joined into light frames. Canvas and hessian were stretched across false hulls. Paint crews added dark shapes where wheels, turrets, and shadows should appear from above. Some dummy tanks were light enough for a group of soldiers to lift and carry across the sand. The strangest device was called the Sunshield. It was a split wooden and canvas cover placed over a real tank. Once assembled, the angular silhouette of the armored vehicle disappeared beneath the box-like outline of an ordinary lorry. The engine, tracks, and weapon remained real. Only the identity changed. If one cover tore loose or cast the wrong shadow, a reconnaissance photograph could expose the entire northern concentration. But the British had already tested the principle. From the correct altitude, the disguised vehicle did not look like a badly hidden tank. It looked like a truck because the observer expected trucks to be there. This was the first half of Bertram. Hide the real. The second half was more ambitious. Show the false. A few dummy vehicles would not be enough. Axis analysts compared photographs over time. They looked for units arriving, depots expanding, tracks multiplying, and support systems growing behind the front. A tank formation without fuel, guns, workshops, or water would look suspicious. So Barkas and Ayrton were not asked to build props. They were asked to build military behavior. That meant every false object needed a reason to exist. Every road had to lead somewhere. Every concentration needed supply. Every new shadow had to fit the previous day's photograph. The deception had to grow gradually, because real armies do not appear in the desert all at once. The men building it also had to remain invisible. One careless conversation in Cairo, one worker wandering outside the restricted camp, or one pilot photographing a dummy at the wrong stage of construction could reveal that the Southern Army was hollow. The stakes were brutally physical. If Bertram failed, Axis guns would not fire at canvas. They would be waiting for British infantry and tank crews at the real breach points. Traditional camouflage tried to erase an object from the battlefield. Barkas reversed the logic. He would hide real weapons by giving them harmless identities and protect them with an entire army made from wood, cloth, and expectation. The false army began to grow in the southern desert. It could not appear overnight. A real armored formation arrives in stages. First come scattered vehicles, then guns, fuel, workshops, stores, water points, and the roads connecting them. If hundreds of tanks suddenly appeared between two reconnaissance flights, Axis analysts would suspect a trick. So Bertram was built slowly. In an area the camouflage officers called Brian, after camouflage artist Brian Robb, work parties assembled more than 700 false supply stacks. Robb helped translate military stores into shapes that would read correctly from the air. Wooden boxes were arranged into the rectangular body of a lorry. Smaller piles formed the cab and engine. Camouflage netting blurred the edges. From the ground, the objects looked like crude heaps. From the air, they became transport vehicles parked in orderly lines. Farther forward, the armored force took shape. Roughly 500 dummy tanks and about 150 dummy guns were produced for the wider deception. Many were made from palm frond hurdles covered with calico. Some were fixed to the ground. Others were lightweight frames carried on jeeps, allowing a vehicle with 4 wheels and a small engine to cast the silhouette of a tank column moving through the desert. The illusion depended on more than shape. A tank that never moved left no tracks. A depot without traffic looked abandoned. A gun position without men, vehicles, or disturbed sand looked like a model. Real lorries, therefore, drove through parts of the false concentration, turning circles, stopping beside dummy stores, and cutting believable routes into the sand. Crews shifted objects between reconnaissance flights. Fresh tracks appeared beside new equipment. Older tracks became scarred by wind. The phantom force did not merely occupy space, it seemed to work. That detail mattered, because an aerial photograph records absence as clearly as presence. A line of dummy tanks without fuel or maintenance vehicles would tell the enemy that something was wrong. But tanks beside supply lorries, guns, tracks, and expanding depots suggested a formation preparing for combat. Each object confirmed the next. The British also had to conceal the real logistical mass in the north. Near El Alamein railway station, more than 100,000 4-gallon petrol tins were concealed inside roughly 100 stone-faced slit trenches. In total, about 2,000 tons of petrol were hidden near the station. From above, the trench walls cast shadows over the cans, making the fuel almost disappear. Food created a different problem. Boxes of rations could not simply be erased from the sand. Camouflage crews stacked them into the rough shape of trucks and draped nets over the piles. Sugar, cigarettes, and other supplies sat inside structures designed to look like vehicles. Real supplies became false trucks in the north. False supplies became real-looking depots in the south. The deception was no longer a collection of dummy tanks. It was an exchange of identities across the entire battlefield, and every exchange had to survive daylight. Imagine a work party before sunrise, pulling Hessian tight over a palm frond turret while another crew smooths the sand around its base. A lorry drives past twice to press tracks beside it. Men step backward, looking not at the object itself, but at its shadow. They are not asking whether it looks like a tank from 20 yards away. They are asking whether it will still look like one when a camera passes thousands of feet overhead. If the tracks ended abruptly, if a depot had no access road, or if sunlight passed through a torn canvas hull, The false core could collapse into a field of props, but the greater risk was strategic. If Axis analysts dismissed the southern buildup, they would turn their attention north, toward the real armor and the real breach points. The dummy army, therefore, had to become more convincing every day. More vehicles appeared, more stores accumulated, more roads formed between them. The pattern grew with the same slow, expensive logic as an actual offensive. The British were not trying to make canvas equal steel. They were making every clue surrounding the canvas prove that steel had to be there. Now, picture the desert from an Axis reconnaissance room. No single photograph revealed the British plan, but each new photograph appeared to confirm the last. Picture an Axis intelligence officer bending over a table beneath a shaded lamp. He places one aerial image beside another, marks new vehicle parks in pencil, and measures the distance between yesterday's pipeline and today's unfinished end. In the south, more vehicles gathered, supply dumps expanded, gun positions appeared, tracks spread outward from roads that had seemed empty a week earlier. Behind them, engineers were building what looked like a water pipeline toward the false concentration. That pipeline was the most dangerous object in Operation Bertram because it did more than suggest a direction. It suggested a date. A mechanized army in the western desert could not move without water. Men needed it. Radiators needed it. Workshops, field hospitals, kitchens, and maintenance units all depended on it. If the British were preparing their main blow in the south, then a pipeline, pumping stations, storage tanks, and distribution points had to reach the assembly area first. The camouflage teams built exactly that story. Sections of dummy pipe were laid across the sand in measured stages. False pumping installations appeared behind the advancing end. Elevated tanks and water points made the construction look like a functioning military project rather than a line of abandoned material. The apparent rate of progress was slow enough to be useful. At roughly 5 miles a day, the unfinished pipeline became a ruler Axis analysts could place against the calendar, follow its movement, estimate the remaining distance, and the likely attack date seemed to calculate itself. The offensive, they could conclude, was coming from the south, but not yet. That conclusion mattered more than whether every section of pipe could survive close inspection. The Axis did not need to believe the pipeline was perfect. They needed to believe that its progress matched everything else they were seeing. And it did. The false armor required water. The false depots required roads. The roads accumulated real tracks. The tracks led toward activity. Each clue appeared independent, yet every one had been designed to support the same answer. This was the decision debt inside Axis intelligence. Once the southern concentration had been accepted as real, each new photograph was interpreted through that belief. A pump house did not raise a new question. It answered an old one. Another length of pipe did not weaken the theory. It gave the theory a timetable. Meanwhile, the north looked far less alarming. Rows of vehicles appeared to be ordinary lorries. Stores had been disguised. The real armored concentration had not yet revealed its final form. From the Axis perspective, this was not gullibility. It was disciplined analysis. They saw a desert army assembling where its logistics said it must assemble. They saw preparations moving at the pace construction allowed. They saw exactly what a serious offensive should leave behind. They did not see that the evidence was circular. The tanks proved the depots were necessary. The depots proved the pipeline mattered. The pipeline proved the attack could not begin yet. And the apparent delay made the northern activity easier to dismiss. If the Axis recognized the pipeline as a decoy before the final concentration, the entire timetable would collapse. Reconnaissance would shift north. Reserves could be repositioned. British assault troops might meet armor and anti-tank guns already waiting behind the minefields. But until that happened, the pipe kept advancing across the sand. It carried no water. It carried confidence. By October, the deception had given Axis planners something more powerful than a false target. It had given them a false deadline. And now Bertram approached its most vulnerable moment. The real tanks still had to move. For weeks, ordinary lorries had stood openly in the northern assembly areas. Axis reconnaissance photographed them, counted them, and eventually stopped treating them as a mystery. Far behind the front, British tanks remained visible in their familiar holding grounds. Beginning 2 nights before the attack, that picture had to be reversed without appearing to change. After darkness, the lorries in the north pulled away. Real crusaders, Valentines, Grants, and Shermans moved forward along marked desert routes, their engines muffled by distance but their tracks cutting fresh scars into the sand. Each tank entered a space where a harmless truck had been seen the previous day. Then the camouflage crews closed the sunshield around it. The canopy came in two light halves, hinged along the sides of the tank. Several men could raise the sections, lock them together, and turn a fighting vehicle into the box-shaped outline of a transport lorry. Hundreds of sunshields had been prepared for this work. The steel did not vanish, it changed category. But the movement created a second danger. The holding areas behind the front were now empty. If an Axis aircraft photographed those spaces at dawn, analysts would see that the armor had moved forward, so another set of crews followed the departing tanks. They dragged dummy hulls into the exact places the real vehicles had occupied. Palm frond frames and canvas turrets settled over the old track marks. The substitutes had to face the same direction, cast similar shadows, and preserve the spacing visible in earlier photographs. One missing row could reveal a brigade on the move. One reconnaissance aircraft arriving before the replacement was complete could collapse 4 weeks of deception in a single frame. This was the vulnerable middle of Bertram. The real tanks were no longer safely in the rear, but they had not yet disappeared beneath their false identities near the front. For several hours, the British order of battle existed between two images, and both had to be repaired before daylight. The desert made every mistake permanent, until the wind erased it. Tank tracks did not stop at a camouflage cover. Heavy vehicles left deep parallel cuts, while lorries marked the sand differently. Crews swept, dragged brush, redirected traffic, and used the existing confusion of roads to prevent one trail from pointing directly toward the assault concentration. According to later accounts, the weather nearly exposed the illusion. Shortly before the battle, a powerful dust storm tore through parts of the dummy army. Canvas ripped loose, lightweight structures twisted or collapsed. Shapes that had looked convincing from the air became exposed ribs and broken cloth. Tony Ayrton and the camouflage teams worked through the damage. Men pulled new fabric over frames, reset dummy vehicles, repaired sunshields, and restored the shadows before reconnaissance could record what the storm had revealed. They were repairing objects that could not fire, move under their own power, or protect a single soldier. Yet, if those objects failed, real men would pay for it. By the final night, the northern assembly areas held the armored force Montgomery intended to use. Real guns had also moved forward under box-shaped cannibal covers that made them resemble trucks. In the rear, dummy tanks preserved the appearance that the armor was still 2 or more days from the battlefield. In the south, the Phantom concentration remained surrounded by tracks, depots, guns, and an unfinished pipeline. Now picture the first Axis reconnaissance photograph after the substitution. The Southern Army is still growing. The pipeline is still incomplete. Tanks remain visible far behind the front. The northern sector still appears crowded with ordinary transport. Nothing important seems to have changed. That was the final reversal. The objects in the photograph were almost all where intelligence expected them to be. Only their identities had changed. By sunrise, the tanks had moved. The picture had not. At 9:40 on the night of the 23rd of October 1942, the northern horizon turned white. Hundreds of British guns opened together. Shells crossed the dark and struck Axis minefields, artillery positions, telephone lines, and forward defenses. The noise rolled across the desert. Then the infantry moved. Rommel was in Germany on medical leave when the bombardment began. General Georg Stumme was commanding Panzer Army Africa in his absence. Stumme died during a frontline inspection on October 24, and Rommel returned to the battlefield the following day. Engineers went ahead with detectors, markers, and explosive charges, trying to cut lanes through the Devil's Gardens. Behind them waited the tanks that had looked like lorries from the air. If those lanes closed under fire, the armor would become a traffic jam inside a killing ground. Operation Bertram had delivered surprise. It had not delivered an easy battle. German and Italian troops fought from prepared positions. Anti-tank guns covered the minefields. Cleared routes became clogged with vehicles, wounded men, broken equipment, and dust. The first assaults did not tear the Axis line open. Montgomery was forced into a grinding contest of artillery, infantry, engineering, and replacement tanks. That distinction matters. Canvas did not defeat Rommel's army. A fake pipeline could not clear a mine. Dummy guns could not destroy an 88. Bertram's achievement was narrower and more precise. It protected the real concentration until the moment protection mattered most. While the main weight struck in the north, the southern sector still presented a believable threat. The phantom armor remained visible. The depots still seemed active. The pipeline still looked unfinished. Axis commanders could not instantly abandon everything inferred from weeks of reconnaissance because the evidence had not disappeared when the bombardment began. The wrong battlefield continued demanding attention while the real one was already burning. For nearly 2 weeks, the 8th Army pushed through the defensive system. Australian troops fought savage actions in the north. British and Commonwealth infantry widened the corridors. Artillery consumed mountains of ammunition. Tank units attacked, withdrew, reorganized, and attacked again. By early November, the Axis position was breaking. On November 4, Montgomery's armor passed through the weakened line. German and Italian formations began retreating west. Some units escaped. Others, short of fuel or transport, were left behind. Alamein became one of the first major Allied land victories against the Axis. 4 days later, Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch. The Axis armies in North Africa were now caught inside a strategic vise. Montgomery advancing from Egypt, Anglo-American forces entering from the west, and the Mediterranean supply route under pressure. Alamein did not end the North African War, but it changed its direction permanently. Operation Bertram did not win that campaign alone. Montgomery possessed more men, tanks, guns, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition. His infantry still crossed exposed ground. His engineers still entered the minefields. Thousands of soldiers still paid for victory. But Bertram made that strength arrive in the correct place without announcing itself clearly enough for the enemy to prepare with certainty. That was its legacy. Military deception is often imagined as secrecy, hidden plans, coded signals, and locked rooms. Bertram demonstrated something colder. The enemy could observe freely, provided every visible fact had been arranged to support the wrong conclusion. The surviving photographs preserve the irony. In one image, a real Crusader tank sits beneath a sunshield, reduced to the harmless outline of a truck. Farther south, a tank made from palm ribs and cloth stands in the open, commanding attention without an engine, armor, or crew. The pipeline carried no water, but it delivered what Montgomery needed: a false direction and a false date. Rommel's army watched the desert for weeks. It found the army Britain wanted it to find and missed the one preparing to attack. Subscribe for more hidden operations where cheap materials, false signals, and overlooked details change the course of war.